When I married Consuela, I was overjoyed. She brought an endless stream of smiles and joy into my life. Beautiful, kind, and compassionate, she was a dream, not just a woman. We loved each other as they often write in books, but life, unfortunately, is not a story written by an author. When Kayla became pregnant, we faced challenges. The pregnancy was difficult, and my wife had to quit her job so as not to harm the baby. I did my best to support Consuela, and we eagerly awaited the arrival of the new member of the family. We both wanted children very much and often discussed the names we would give them. But when it came time to give birth, everything turned upside down. The birth was very long and extremely difficult. The baby was positioned incorrectly, and the doctors had to help the mother. However, as soon as the baby was born, the doctors immediately turned their attention to my wife, who was bleeding internally. While I nervously paced the corridor, waiting for news, the doctors fought for my beloved wife's life. The operation lasted almost 8 hours, but in the end, my wife's heart couldn't withstand the strain that followed the difficult birth, and Consuela passed away. The day that was supposed to be a celebration for our family was overshadowed by the death of the love of my life. When they showed me my daughter, a tiny bundle lying in a crib among other vulnerable newborns on the ward, I burst into tears. The baby still didn't know she had lost her mother, and the only one left for her was me, who felt despair and immense sadness after losing my wife. While my daughter was still in hospital, she was helped not only by the nurses, but also by several other mothers who heard about the girl's difficult fate. The maternity ward was full of kind souls who held my daughter, giving her what she lacked: a mother's touch, the warmth of her body, and much-needed milk. Immensely grateful to these kind women, I couldn't grieve for long. I had to think about what to do next now that I was completely alone with my daughter. I named her what Consuela wanted, and the girl was called Luca. My workplace understood the situation and granted me a short leave to organize my wife's funeral. During the few days I dealt with organizational matters, I cried many times for my wife and despaired. However, each time I calmed down, I remembered the vulnerable little bundle waiting for me in the hospital. The child was an innocent soul that I now had to take care of, and I had to do it, if only for the memory of my dead wife. I had to pull myself together and become a worthy father to our daughter. After the funeral, where I heard many kind words and wishes, I returned to work with a heavy heart, not putting off the difficult conversation with my boss. Antonio Torres was a man of old-school firmness, strict, severe, but fair. That's why, even though many subordinates feared him, I respected him. Here's the thing. Antonio frowned, listening to my colleague's story about being left alone with a child in his arms. I understand how that might sound. However, I can offer a decent solution to this situation. Generally, maternity leave is taken by women, for obvious reasons, but our company policies don't prohibit men from taking this leave. I didn't know, I admitted honestly. Unfortunately, this leave is poorly paid, Antonio interrupted my surprised exclamation. However, I also understand that if women have husbands who can support them during this time, you have no one. So here's my proposal. You take maternity leave, but you keep working from home. You can do some of the work remotely, and I'm willing to give you this opportunity so that your daughter doesn't go hungry. Antonio, you have no idea how much this will help me. I was ready to fall to my knees in front of my boss to thank him. I'll give you all the time you need. You're a diligent and reliable worker, and I wouldn't want to lose you because of life's twists and turns. And your daughter is not to blame for any of this. She needs to eat. So don't worry about the money. I'll discuss all this with the department, and we'll organize the tasks so that everything that can be done remotely will be sent to you. But remember one thing, the little one needs time and care too. Of course, I hadn't forgotten that. I took my boss's outstretched hand and shook it firmly. I won't forget that, Antonio. The boss simply nodded in response. From then on, I rarely showed up at the office unless it was absolutely necessary. Fortunately, I rarely attended meetings, and some could be held by phone or video call. As soon as I took Luca home from the maternity hospital, I realized how difficult it was to look after a newborn. I was torn between many tasks, facing new problems all the time. I had never before imagined how difficult it was to look after children, and my little one was restless. Whenever I tried to feed her formula, she would start fussing and spitting up. So I started going to the milk kitchen every day to make sure my daughter always had something to eat, leaving formula for the most extreme cases. For 3 months, I adjusted to the fact that the child required constant attention, combining the care of the little one with work, which I always tried to do when my daughter fell asleep in her crib, cradled by me. That day, everything went wrong. I arrived late at the milk kitchen, and there was nothing to feed Luca except formula, which she didn't like. For several hours, I tried to feed her, but she whimpered and wouldn't eat, being capricious, and I struggled to hold back the tears. How could women do all this? Suddenly, there was a knock on the door, and I wiped away the tears that had formed in my eyes before opening it. Standing in the doorway with her hands on her hips was my neighbor Mariella. I knew that she had also recently given birth, and the stern expression on her face made me feel ashamed. My daughter must have woken up her baby. "Dio," the woman nodded to me, who was cradling my crying daughter. "Mariella, I'm sorry, Luca." The woman raised her hand, cutting off my words, and shook her head. "Here's the thing, neighbor. I hear your little one crying almost every day. It's because of the formula, she doesn't like it." The widower tried to justify himself. "Yes, it's true." The woman's eyes lit up. "Good. Then we can help each other." I frowned, surprised. "Help?" "As you already know, I gave birth to a son," Mariella approached, looking at the little girl in my arms. "And unfortunately, I have a lot of milk. I have nowhere to store it. Throwing milk away breaks my heart, and your daughter needs milk. I won't take no for an answer. I can't listen to your child crying her heart out." I almost cried, although the woman spoke sternly. I was immensely grateful for her kindness in offering help to the single father who was already beginning to despair. Thus began the friendship and mutual assistance between Mariella and me. The woman not only supplied me with surplus milk, but also looked after my daughter when I needed to go out. In return, I started going to the market to do the shopping for her. She would give me a list, and I would leave my daughter with her to do the shopping not only for me, but also for her. Without a doubt, Mariella was an angel sent by God to help me, and in return, I tried to help her too. Sometimes the woman needed rest and fresh air, so I would take the children, and Mariella could go for a walk without worrying about the child being supervised. The months passed, the child gradually grew up, and I began to realize that even with the part-time job, I was running out of money. Things for children were expensive, and the little girl seemed to be growing not by the day, but by the hour. And Mariella came to my rescue again, offering to look after the girl if I decided to go back to working part-time in the office. I was grateful to my neighbor for this generous offer, although I had my doubts at first. "Don't worry, Dio. Luca is an angel when she's not forced to drink formula. It's not difficult for me, and you can be sure that she's in good, loving hands while you work," Mariella replied to my doubts, smiling. "And my son behaves better when she's around, as if he were a big brother." And so our cooperation began. I would go to work, leaving my daughter with Mariella for the first half of the day, and then pick her up, continuing to work from home. As the years went by, Luca and Mariella's son Dante started going to kindergarten. Mariella and I would arrange to take the children to and from kindergarten together. The neighbor helped me get closer to my daughter, and I gradually learned from Mariella how to braid my daughter's hair or make ponytails, choose dresses and shoes that pleased Luca. I took out the almost forgotten fishing rods and bait boxes, gifts given to me by Consuela, and started to go fishing occasionally. These days spent in silence and tranquility helped me restore my mental balance. I realized how incredibly lucky I was in life. Although a cruel twist of fate took away my beloved wife that very day, I gained a daughter whom I loved with all my heart. With each passing day, I saw more of my wife reflected in Luca. The little girl grew up beautiful, and my heart broke as I realized what this could mean in the future. I was right. At the age of 12, Luca reached adolescence, bringing a new dose of chaos into our lives. I dreaded the estrangement between father and daughter, and feared the idea of my little girl attracting the attention of boys who would surely notice her beauty with her thick, wavy hair, the color of a crow's wings, and big brown eyes in her delicate face. Mariella helped me as much as she could, but I had to deal with my daughter's sudden mood swings and new whims. One morning, barely awake, I was preparing breakfast, contemplating whether to send Luca to school on a full stomach before going to work myself. But a sudden scream from her room filled me with terror, as if I had been hit by an electric shock. I ran to her room, fearing that something irreversible might have happened. I entered the room and found Luca ripping the sheets off the bed, sobbing uncontrollably. The panicked man noticed a blood stain on the sheet and the sweater tied around the girl's hips. "Luca, what happened?" I asked, holding my daughter and hugging her. She was crying, trembling in my arms, unable to calm down enough to tell me what had happened. I didn't press her for details, already suspecting what had happened. I tried to calm down too. If my suspicions were correct, I would face a very difficult conversation with my daughter. While I was comforting Luca, I managed to send a message to her school and to my workplace, informing them that we would probably be late. I also sent a message to Mariella, but I didn't specify the reasons, just saying that Luca wasn't well. Finally, the girl stopped crying and I heard her trembling voice. "Dad, I think I'm dying," Luca sobbed. "Darling, I'm sure that's not it," I replied, stroking her shoulder, "but I'm bleeding and I can't stop." With a heavy heart, I tried to explain to my daughter that everything that was happening was normal for any woman. I tried to tell her everything I knew, remembering what I had learned in biology lessons at school about human anatomy and what I had learned living with Consuela. Luca listened attentively, although he could see the embarrassment on my face. It was uncomfortable for me to discuss all this with her. "I'm sure Aunt Mariella can tell you more about what to do in these situations. I'm sorry," I finally concluded the conversation. As if by fate, at that moment, Mariella appeared at the apartment door. The woman, having sent her son to school, had immediately come to help her neighbor with Luca's illness. "Aunt Mariella!" The little girl ran up to the woman, hugging her and crying again. Mariella gently stroked the girl's back, meeting my gaze, and I sighed. "Mariella, please help me again." Luca started menstruating. I told her everything I knew, but you know. Mariella's face lit up with a broad smile. She was already worried that something serious had happened, but when she heard the news, she said, "Oh, darling." And the woman leaned over to the girl, wiping the tears from her face. "Come with me. Today will be your day. No school, no worries. I'll help you with everything you need." She looked at me and I nodded, grateful that my neighbor was such a kind and caring woman. For a single father, that really was a blessing. "Luca, don't worry about school today," I said to my daughter. "I'll call them and let them know you're not going. Mariella will help you with everything you need." And although I handled the day with dignity, the distance between me and my daughter grew over time. I was struggling to raise a teenager. Luca began to transform into a beautiful young woman, and I began to look suspiciously at her increasingly short skirts and gradually fading makeup. Fortunately, Mariella continued to help me, often taking my daughter shopping for clothes and cosmetics. She even taught Luca how to apply makeup in a way that wasn't vulgar or too provocative. It was precisely my lack of knowledge about these matters that made me an enemy in the eyes of the teenager. Conflicts began to arise, and everything I said was interpreted in the worst possible way by Luca, who often slammed the bedroom door. When Luca turned 16, the conflicts reached their peak. She often shouted at me, had fits of rage, and tried to act like an adult and be independent. I remembered the chubby little girl I used to spoil when I was little, and felt a growing despair. Luca was growing up and was no longer the little girl who asked me to braid her hair and help her choose a dress and shoes for the first day of school. Following Mariella's advice, I backed off a little, stopping trying to force my company on her. That didn't change much, but Luca shouted at me less, and I saw that as a good sign. At weekends, I still went fishing. This helped me clear my head and gather strength for the new working week and the emerging conflicts with my daughter. However, even though I started to give my daughter a little freedom, she drifted further and further away from me until one day I came home and found the apartment completely empty. Luca's room was empty, as was his school bag, although his books and notebooks were scattered on the table. Luca didn't answer calls, messages remained unread, and, in the morning, I discovered with concern that her phone was switched off. Nervous, I went to work without sleeping, spending the whole day in a trance, constantly trying to call my daughter. I became increasingly worried. What if something had happened? As soon as I finished work, I returned home and, not finding Luca again, decided to waste no time and went to the police station. The officers listened to me, but reluctantly filled in the documents, saying that my daughter probably just went out with friends and her phone died. Listening to all these excuses, I realized with horror that the officers didn't see the problem. My daughter, my only daughter, was missing, and they didn't even intend to look for her. From that day on, my life became a nightmare. I'd wake up, pick up the phone, and try to call my daughter, but the phone was still switched off, sending me to voicemail. I'd go to work, still hoping that when I got home, I'd find Luca in her room, so disobedient and capricious, resenting me for talking to her. I would return to the empty and uncomfortable apartment, call the police station to ask if they had found my daughter, but all was in vain. The first weekend after Luca's disappearance, for the first time in a long time, I didn't go fishing and spent the days alone, sometimes crying, sometimes calming myself with the hope that Luca might turn up at any moment. The second weekend became so unbearable that on Sunday I took my tackle and went fishing just to distract myself from the dark thoughts running through my mind. "I'll be back and Luca will be home," I whispered like a prayer as I sat on the shore of the lake. But when I returned, I still couldn't find my daughter. So I took time off work and went back to the police station. This time I wasn't just nervous, I was furious. With shouts and pleas, I forced the officers to listen to me again. I told them everything over and over again, first to the sergeant at the front desk and then to another officer. The latter was more attentive and took me seriously. It was then that the case of Luca's disappearance was finally opened. I stayed at the police station for hours, giving descriptions of my daughter, what she might be wearing, which friends she might be looking for. I didn't leave until the evening, exhausted and drained, but with the feeling that now the police would really look for my daughter. Another week passed with no news, then another and another, but Luca was still missing. I despaired of finding my daughter, although I still called the police to ask about any progress. At first, I did it weekly. Then the calls became less frequent, once a month, once every 2 months, and so 2 years passed. During that time, I lost weight, got thinner and older, while worries about my missing daughter took their toll. If it hadn't been for Mariella and Dante, who regularly visited me at night, I might have given up completely. But my kind neighbors helped me keep going and made sure I didn't get hungry. "You'll see, Dio," Mariella always reassured me. "Luca will be back and you'll be trying to figure out how to please that little devil." I tried to smile, even though I no longer really believed that my daughter would be found. But the hope with which Dante and her mother spoke of it kept a small flame of belief in me that one day I would return home and Luca would be there, grown up, wiser, still as loved as before, despite all the whims and arguments. That Saturday, I took my place on the shore of a large lake that has always had a special place in my heart. It was the same lake where I used to picnic with Consuela while my wife was still alive. And although I still regularly visited Consuela's grave, it was here that I felt a special connection with my deceased wife. The fishing wasn't going well. I kept thinking about my missing daughter, which constantly distracted me from watching the buoy. Finally, I gave up, put the fishing rod aside, and simply sat on the shore, pondering what could have happened to my daughter and praying to God that Luca would be found. Even after all this time, I still believed that my daughter would come back to me. I didn't immediately hear the noise coming from somewhere nearby, but when I finally turned around, I noticed a very young boy struggling in the water. The boy wasn't screaming. He was trying with all his might to stay above the surface of the water, but the panic on his face was evident enough for me to realize immediately that he was drowning. Without thinking twice, I ran into the lake. Reaching the boy wasn't difficult, but taking the time to grab the panicked child was. He struggled and resisted, as if he didn't understand that someone was trying to save him. But eventually, I managed to pull the boy to the shore, where I discovered that despite swallowing water, he was relatively okay. The frightened boy, only 11 years old, was struggling to catch his breath and pull himself together for a long time, and while I was comforting him, I suddenly noticed a pendant around the boy's neck, which shocked me. I looked at the simple silver pendant in the shape of a small arrowhead and couldn't believe my eyes. It was the pendant I had ordered from the jeweler for my daughter. I was sure it was Luca's ornament. I spent hours with the jeweler creating a unique pattern on the facets of this arrowhead. Although the pendant looked simple, the patterns were unmistakable. Hidden within the seemingly wavy lines were birds and leaves, creating a pattern that resembled Damascus steel. "What's your name, kid?" I finally found my voice. "Javier." The boy hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Nice pendant. Where did you get it?" "Dad gave it to me," Javier replied. Although I wanted to ask more, at that moment a group of boys approached, led by an older boy, apparently the older brother of one of the boys. They surrounded Javier, asking if he was all right, and the older boy turned to me. "Thank you. We lost sight of him, and you were there at just the right moment." "Oh, it's nothing," I tried to deflect. "I was just fishing from the shore and saw the boy drowning. What kind of person would I be if I allowed him to drown?" I regretted not being able to ask more about the rescued boy and the pendant. The teenagers thanked me for a long time, and when they left, led by the older brother of one of them, I sat on the shore for a long time, thinking that I couldn't be wrong. The pendant undoubtedly belonged to Luca. Perhaps she had lost it or sold it to earn money to buy a ticket somewhere. I didn't know what to make of these conjectures. Deep in thought, I went home. The neighbors who visited me found me in such a gloomy state that they tried to find out what had happened, why I was so distraught. The police finally found Luca, and the news was not at all cheerful, but I remained silent, lost in thought, and Mariella and Dante left without bothering me. The next evening, I decided to visit my friend, but when she opened the door, I saw that she was nervous. "What's wrong, Mariella?" I asked immediately, forgetting the reason for my visit. "Oh, it's my husband. Something happened at work, but I still don't understand exactly what. Come in, maybe he can tell you what's bothering him. He's not being himself." The woman invited me in. At the kitchen table, I gratefully accepted a fresh cup of coffee and saw Mariella's husband sitting there, lost in thought. "You know our boss, the owner of the factory. He's looking for someone," Juan said, looking confused. "Looking for who?" I frowned. "They say someone saved his son from drowning in a lake, a fisherman apparently." The man shrugged. "And now my boss wants the whole department to find this savior. He probably wants to reward him. I don't know." There was something about the way the speaker delivered all this that didn't seem right to me. It seemed that such news should have been interesting to the man, but for some reason he was tense and spoke reluctantly. He knew that Wen had been working at the factory for years and understood that his superiors could easily give a bonus to whoever found the savior. Could this be the reason why Wen was so tense? "Darling, why are you so down?" Mariella, his wife, tried to support him. "Listen," I chimed in, "I don't know why you're so upset, but I came to apologize to Mariella and Dante for yesterday. When they came to visit me, I wasn't in the best of moods, and all because the day before I saved a boy from the lake while I was fishing. That shook me up so much that—" "Wait," Wen looked at me. "Are you saying that you saved the boy?" "Yes, I was just in the right place at the right time." Wen picked up the phone and quickly typed a very long message to someone. Only when he had sent it did he relax. "Here's the thing, neighbor," he exhaled. "I know it may be nothing to you, but—" Wen's phone emitted a notification sound, and he read the message he had received. His face lit up with a smile. "Dio, my friend, the factory manager wants to see you in person to thank you for saving his son." I pondered, but realized that meeting the father of the rescued boy could provide answers to some questions. So I couldn't resist, and gave Wen permission to arrange the meeting, which made him very happy. Evidently, he was expecting a reward for finding the rescuer. A few days later, I arrived at the address provided by Wen and was surprised to see a large, luxurious mansion, which I was immediately allowed to enter. Parking the car, I stared at the mansion for a moment, not knowing what to think. Although Javier, the boy's father, had invited me, I felt a heaviness in my heart. I still harbored the same questions that had tormented me the day I rescued the boy from the lake and saw the pendant around his neck, which I had previously seen on my daughter. As soon as the doors opened, I saw a tall, imposing man, smiling broadly at me. "So, you're the one who saved my son." A firm handshake turned into a hug in an instant. Surprised by what was happening, I didn't resist, understanding perfectly well that the boy's parents simply couldn't contain their joy at finally seeing their son's savior. "Oh, come on," I tried to deflect. No. You're a hero, at least in my eyes. Javier told me everything. You saved my son, and that means a lot to me. Come in, let's have a drink and celebrate the fact that there are still decent people in the world." I was practically pulled in and almost immediately handed a glass of expensive, perfumed drink. The man didn't stay long, and, slightly tense, asked. I couldn't help noticing the beautiful pendant around the boy's neck. Where did he get it? There was something about the change in the factory owner's demeanor that didn't seem right to me. He seemed to tense up almost instantly, as if he were getting nervous and shaking his head. "The pendant? I think I found it somewhere at a flea market when I was doing some shopping. Maybe you can remember where exactly." "Listen, hero. Forget the pendant. We're celebrating my son's rescue." The man tried to change the subject. "We should thank the Lord that you were there on the shore at the right time in the right place." "Yes, that's true. It's just, what's your interest in this ornament?" The abrupt change of tone to a more irritated one revealed that the factory owner was trying to hide something. I sighed, setting my glass aside, and shook my head, realizing that I wouldn't be able to find out everything I wanted to. Something was wrong, and I didn't like being in that mansion one bit. "I won't waste your time." I turned and left. The owner of the mansion shouted something behind me, trying to call me back, but I wasn't listening, leaving the opulent but inhospitable place where I had hoped to find answers to my questions, only to find suspicion in the host's strange behavior. Disappointed by the time lost, I had almost reached my car when the boy I had rescued caught up with me. "Sir," called the boy as he approached. "Sir, please wait." I sighed, but turned to the child, forcing a smile. "Hello, Javier. How are you feeling?" "Better, The boy looked over his shoulder and lowered his voice as if afraid of being overheard. "I need to talk to you." I frowned, seeing the seriousness and determination in the boy's eyes. When he gestured for me to come closer, I didn't object, but when the child started whispering, I almost staggered. The boy was telling me that his beloved father was not a good person. Javier told me that there were many people in his father's factory who worked there against their will. The boy saw them, emaciated, miserable, living in the same place, in sheds and in horrible conditions. At first, it was hard to believe, but the boy spoke so quickly, coherently, and in such detail that I couldn't doubt that he was undoubtedly telling the truth. When Javier finished his account, he looked at me hopefully. "I love my father with all my heart, but I can't keep this secret any longer. These people, they have families, loved ones. And this pendant," the boy held up the ornament. "Dad gave it to me after visiting the factory. You know him, don't you?" "Yes," I mumbled, barely able to control my voice. "I do. So someone you know is among those unfortunate souls?" I looked towards the mansion, thoughts spinning in my head. "Here's the thing, Javier. You want to help those people your father keeps in the factory, don't you?" "Yes," the boy nodded. "Then meet me tomorrow at noon near the police station." I saw the boy nod again. "Promise?" "I promise." Javier tried to take the pendant off and give it to me, but I shook my head. "You'll give it to me when we find my daughter, right?" The boy hugged the pendant to his chest and nodded. "I'll help you find her, sir. I promise." Leaving the grounds of the mansion, I felt real hope for the first time in a long time. The boy's words not only horrified me, but also allowed my heart to feel warm again, the thirst to know. Was my daughter really in that factory? The next day, I waited anxiously for Javier at the gates of the police station. Although I didn't have to wait long, I began to worry and doubt. What if the boy had gotten scared and didn't show up? But, contrary to all my doubts, I suddenly saw the child riding his bicycle straight towards me with the same serious and confident expression on his face. Without wasting any time, we both went into the police station, and I asked to see the officer in charge of my daughter's missing person case. We had to wait for almost an hour, and when we were finally taken to a separate room, I saw a tired police officer, clearly not wanting to face another desperate father, just to inform him that there had been no progress in the case. However, this time the conversation with the officer took a different turn. I told the officer everything I had learned from Javier about how the boy's father kept people locked up and forced them to work in inhumane conditions. The officer listened with a skeptical expression, as if he didn't believe a word of it. But then Javier stepped forward and pulled a pendant from under his collar. "Look, I got this pendant from my father. He gave it to me after visiting your workplace. I saw everything with my own eyes." The policeman frowned and examined the pendant shown by the boy. "Look at the photos of my daughter that I gave you. It's the same pendant. I had it made to order. There are no others like it anywhere," I confirmed. The police officer went through my daughter's case file and found several photos that I had given him at the beginning of the investigation. In all these photos, Luca was smiling and the pendant was shining on his neck, undoubtedly the same one Javier was wearing now. Tense, the policeman pondered for a long moment, then became serious and composed. "I see," he exhaled. "Javier, please tell me again exactly what you saw in your father's factory." The boy understood that he was finally being believed and, without hesitation, told them everything he knew. He remembered the box of documents he saw in one of the offices when he accompanied his father around the factory, and the exhausted workers who looked worn out and sick from their work. He told them everything, including the dirty mattresses he noticed, barely hidden behind the partially open door of one of the utility rooms. The officer listened to the boy, jotting something down in his notebook, and, when he had finished asking clarifying questions, he put the pen aside and looked me in the eye. "Well, we have a lot to do. I'll be in touch, but don't worry, if your daughter is there, we'll get her out," the officer reassured me. "But now I need to process all the necessary paperwork so that my colleagues can enter the factory." The police acted quickly. A search warrant was obtained in record time, and the subsequent operation at the factory took everyone who worked there by surprise. Everyone who had helped Javier's father keep workers illegally detained was arrested, including him, who was also aware of what was going on. Documents and personal belongings confiscated from the workers were discovered, as well as the rooms where they were kept and the victims themselves, who were so exhausted and ill that most had to be transported by ambulance. The case made the headlines. The factory owner's victims included women and men of all ages. Both locals reported missing and recent arrivals from other towns and districts. Among them was Luca, who had disappeared 2 years earlier, recklessly and daringly running away from home from a loving father. While the victims were treated for horrific injuries to their hands due to the constant work on the machines and the beatings they received during their captivity, the police gradually interviewed them. The victims' testimonies, combined with all the evidence found on the factory premises, were enough for the court to sentence the owner and his accomplices to several years in prison. After his father was arrested, Javier stayed with his mother, a woman who had long been suspicious of her husband's illicit activities. She honestly admitted in court everything she suspected. When her husband was arrested, she didn't hesitate to ask for a divorce, as she wanted nothing to do with a man who used slave labor. The money she received after the divorce she didn't spend, although it could have been enough for her and her son to live on for the rest of their lives. Moving to another city, she enrolled Javier in a private school and did everything in her power to ensure that the boy never became like his father. Meanwhile, I was reunited with my daughter, rejoicing at every visit to the hospital. Although she, like the other victims, was undergoing lengthy treatment, she continued to cry every time I entered her room. "Forgive me, Dad, forgive me," I heard from her for the 100th time. "I was so foolish." I hugged her and caressed her shoulder, already happy to have finally found Luca after 2 years. It took several weeks for the girl to recover from the horrible years spent in the factory. Although she used to shout at me, refusing to listen, she now came up to me and cried with happiness with every hug. "I've missed you so much, Dad," she whispered. I missed you too, daughter. I missed you so much, I replied. Forgive me for running away, for yelling at you, for thinking that living with you was hell. I was so wrong. It's all right now. The most important thing is that you're back. Don't cry. I didn't know how to comfort my daughter, but I remembered how I used to take her to the lake where I used to fish, even after her disappearance. Shall we go fishing together, or have a picnic by that lake where we used to go for walks? The same one where you always talked about Mommy, the girl asked, smiling. Yes, the same one where we used to picnic with her. Let's have a picnic. Luca nodded, wiping the tears from his eyes. When she was released from hospital, she was greeted not only by me, but also by Mariella and her son Dante.